the Antiquaries. This is such a special day where we get a true antiquarian day, I hope. My name is Anushka Lester. I run the lectures and the conferences here at the Society of Antiquaries, and I am also a historian of material culture and histories of collecting. And with me, I have Dr. Dustin Fraser-Wood, FSA, who you'll be seeing a lot of today, talking about the work that he does at the Spalding Gentlemen's Society. And then I also have Molly Pye, who is my placement student who's doing a PhD at the University of Leicester. So I want to first thank them for all of the incredible work that they have done in putting this together. And you will meet them properly over the course of the day as they tell you more about their work. But I wanted to make sure that you have seen them and you know that these are the people to go and talk to. So a couple of quick housekeeping things from me. Crucially, because we are live streaming and recording this event, everything that happens in the room needs to be mic'd. So when we get to the point of having a Q&A, there will be a roaming microphone which will be handed around to you. So if you have a question, please wait for the microphone to reach you. And if you're online and you have a question, please post it in the chat and we will ask it in the room. Fire safety, there are no fire drills that are scheduled. So if you hear a fire alarm, I ask you to calmly make your way out through the front door and go assemble at the Joshua Reynolds statue, of course. And if we can't get through that door, there is a fire exit towards the end of the building where the women's toilets are. So I think that's all we need in terms of housekeeping. But I wanted to say what a huge privilege it is to organize a day like this, and particularly to be able to collaborate, not just with my colleagues around Burlington House and also at Kelmscott Manor, but also uniquely for the first time with Spalding Gentlemen's Society. And it's such a delight to have you here and to be able to sort of celebrate the shared histories of our societies and think about where we are respectively going in the future. So a huge thank you to everyone who has contributed, particularly to everyone who is presenting today in various ways, whether that's you're doing a presentation up here or between 12 and 1, we'll have some stalls where you can go and meet people and mingle. And we're really grateful for those contributions. And then thank you to all of you for attending in person and online, and to our colleagues who have made all this possible. So I'm now going to hand over to the president of the Society of Antiquaries, Professor Martin Millett, who will be able to tell you a little bit more about this day and why it's important.
Thank you, Anushka. Thanks to the team for setting this day up. I thought it would be worth just saying a couple of words about the history of the development of these days. They were originally established to introduce PhD students to the Society's collections and its activities. And the aim was and remains to provide a forum where people can see what the resources and facilities of the Society are, and to encourage them to work on our collections and work with our libraries and so forth. But also to encourage a belief that most of us share in the importance of societies like this one, and indeed the Spalding Gentlemen's Society, which have a deep history of engaging with the material past and have promoted its understanding, research on it and communication about it for literally centuries. And those of us who are fellows of the Antiquaries are passionate about ensuring that this tradition not only is preserved, but is living and developed for the future. At a fairly early stage in the evolution of these days, we felt that it was a bit odd shutting the doors on people who weren't just PhD students, but there was interest from fellows, affiliates, and postdoctoral researchers across the subjects that we cover. So it was decided to open the doors on our research day to make them an annual event that celebrated aspects of work. They remain mixture of sharing with you what we have here and what we can offer to you as researchers, and also as a shop window for current research, with a strong emphasis on the people at the cutting edge, PhD students and postdocs who are developing the subject in new and interesting ways. And today's programme represents a further evolution of that, moving beyond the Society with Burlington House and Kelmscott to join with the Spalding Gentlemen's Society to share common interests and research, and in particular this afternoon to let younger scholars share what they're doing, their work and their enthusiasm for our subject with you as an audience. So the emphasis here is on sharing discussion, open research, if you like. I'm afraid for me today, it's a slight tinge with sadness, I've got another meeting to go to this afternoon, actually on a research topic, which means I will miss out on the presentation by younger scholars. But I hope you will all enjoy today as much as I've enjoyed and benefited from previous days like this. And in doing so, recording our thanks to the organisers and the speakers. So without further ado, I will hand over to Alex, our head of collections, who's going to chair this morning session, which highlights aspects of work of our groups, both at Burlington House, Kelmscott, and at Spalding. So, Alex.
Thanks very much, and good morning. So I'm Alexandra Alt. I'm Head of Collections at the Society of Antiquaries and Kelmscott Manor, and I joined 2 months ago in this role. And in the short time that I've been here, I'm struck by the complexity, quality, depth and breadth of our collections. So you'll know we exist across 2 sites, Kelmscott Manor in Oxfordshire and Burlington House in London. And Kelmscott is a 17th century home later inhabited by William Morris, and it contains important collections of furniture, decorative arts, textiles, prints, drawings, paintings, books and tapestries, among other things. And the manor is open to the public for 6 months of the year. And as such, the primary way that people experience those collections is by walking through the house. Kelmscott also hosts exhibitions and has an extensive loans programme, so lots of their objects are actually on display elsewhere. For example, there are objects on display at the Ark in Hampshire at the moment. And there's an ambitious learning and engagement programme as well at Kelmscott that makes significant use of their collections. Burlington House, where we are now, was built for the Society of Antiquaries, and the collections comprise an extensive library of over 130,000 books, journals, as well as important and unique broadsides. And one of the things I think that's really unique about, and it didn't used to be unique, it is now, about our library collections, is they're mostly on open display. And in this day and age, it allows for a speculative and connective kind of research that you can't usually do in big libraries where you're ordering up individual books. We've also got, alongside the library collections, over 1,000 important manuscripts and 300 distinct archives. And while we thought we had about 20,000 prints and drawings, it's about 65,000, most of which are uncatalogued. And our museum collections comprise over 40,000 objects, including some of the paintings you can see on display here and in the other rooms throughout the antiquaries. Bronze Age shields, Viking brooches, Roman amphora, clocks and alabasters, to name just a few. The library and museum are open. The library is open daily. The museum is open by appointment. And as such, the way we experience the collections here are different to how you experience those at Kelmscott. But like Kelmscott, the items here are regularly requested for loan, as well as conservation and research projects. And we've got a lot of objects actually in conservation studios being looked at for reasons of research. And we've got a lot of objects on long-term loan. And as is evidenced by us all sitting here today, our collections are also used extensively by learning and outreach. I'm delighted that we're partnering with the Spalding Gentlemen's Society, whose history and collections significantly overlap with those at the Society of Antiquaries. And I'm excited to hear Dustin and Eleanor speak about the incredible collections the Society holds. So to move on to this morning's programme, unfortunately, Chiara from Burlington House is not available to be here today. So we've got 2 speakers from each site, so 2 from Burlington House, 2 from Kelmscott, and 2 from Spalding Gentlemen's Society. Actually, although Chiara's not here, can I draw your attention to the cases in this room and throughout the ground floor, which contain objects from the Society's collections, including prints and drawings. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of the 2 speakers with the biographies. They'll then present, and then there'll be questions. There'll be 3 sets of questions. So we're going to be starting with Burlington House, and our first 2 speakers are Keller Lawrenson, who's our Assistant Librarian at the Society of Antiquaries of London. As Assistant Librarian, Keller provides reader services, manages the library's print serials holdings, and runs the Society's image service, and so much more. And Dr. Michelle Johansson, who has spent the past 20 years teaching history to learners of all ages and abilities using archive materials and museum objects. She's been Learning and Outreach Manager at the Society of Antiquaries since January 2024. In her spare time, Michelle researches and writes about the biographical aspect of the public library story in the long 19th century. She's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Historical Research, and a trustee of Mass Observation Archive at the University of Sussex. So welcome, Keller, and then we'll pass over to Michelle.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here today. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about our journals, serials holdings, and some of the work that I've been doing on them and the rediscoveries that I've been able to make through those. For those of you who haven't had a chance to visit the Society of Antiquaries basement stacks, they look a little bit like the picture on the left here. The Society have 3 rooms and 2 sets of rolling stacks full of several thousands of titles forming our serials and periodicals collection. In my role, I'm very pleased to manage this collection pictured here, and many of these serials, particularly the international journals, have historically arrived at the library through an exchange system. So journal exchange is essentially a straightforward barter system. We publish the Antiquaries Journal at the Society and we swap it with other academies, other libraries, other various publications across Europe, a 1-for-1, and that makes things a little bit cheaper and smoother for both groups. So it advantages all of us. This year, alongside my colleagues in the library and some experts in the fellowship, who I'm very grateful for, I've been working on a project to review our current serial exchanges programme. And this has landed me in the very fortunate position to be rediscovering some of our records in the form of early 20th century letters that established and maintained these exchange relationships historically. So these letters have been invaluable to complete the review, but what I want to talk about today is that the records are of historical interest to the study of the history of libraries and communications. They're filled with evidence for the ingenuity, collaboration, and network forming amongst libraries during periods of conflict, and also evidence for the devastating impact that international relations can have on libraries' abilities and researchers' abilities to share information across borders. Today, I think these letters are a really wonderful example of day-to-day library work, providing a valuable insight to both staff and researchers of the futures, as well as being able to understand past relationships and networks that existed between academics, libraries, and heritage institutions. So the first set of letters I want to show you are between the Society and the National Library of China. If you look at the letter on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see it was sent on September 29th, 1939, the same month that Poland had invaded Europe and 2 years into the Sino-Japanese War. In this letter, the Secretary of the National Library of China describes having been a regular subscriber to our journal here at the Society of Antiquaries of London. And despite the ongoing conflict, that they had a full run of journals, and it says, in spite of heavy congestion of mails, all issues have been received, which is good news. It's a very optimistic letter, and it's a request for a 1-year subscription that would be complementary to allow Chinese scholars continued access to up-to-date Western scholarship in spite of new legal restrictions that have come in place on purchasing foreign material by the government. I'm pleased to tell you we agreed to this 1-year delay, and then the National Library of China wrote the second letter that you'll see up there, where it states, as Chinese universities and scientific institutions have been forced to migrate to the interior to carry on their work without books and journals, your notable gift will undoubtedly aid materially the cause of education and culture in China, particularly at our time of national emergency. So we can see the war had placed serious pressure on the ability for international scholarly cooperation, and yet libraries, academies, and institutions were working hard to find ways to provide the most up-to-date scholarly information, particularly in this case in our antiquarian fields, rather than just in the sciences or in cartology. All of the research was being valued in spite of the increased governmental restrictions, the disrupted mail routes, and the reallocation of international resources, which I think is a really lovely example to start with, although you will notice this is not actually about an exchange, it is about a subscription. So I'll move on to the exchanges now. So the next few letters I want to talk about are concerned with European exchange agreements, both pre and post the Second World War. During the 1930s, I've noticed by looking at the letters as a whole that the number asking for new exchanges really increases dramatically in the 1930s ahead of the war. I think this does reflect an increasing desire for international cooperation and making these routes easier during times of political tension. So you'll see in these two images, we have the Landesmuseum Hanover and the journal L'Anthropologie requesting exchanges in 1935 and 1936. L'Anthropologie is a particularly interesting example. Here, they request both of the Society's journals that were being published at the time, so Archaeologia and the Antiquaries Journal, in exchange for just their journal. But they do acknowledge that this is a completely unfair swap, and therefore they say that they'll make up the difference by publishing notices about the Society in their journal to try and spread more information about us even further. And they did stick to their word. I've checked their journals, and in the Bulletin Bibliographique at the end, after this letter, they do start including both of the Society's journals, which is does make that a more equal exchange, I think. So some of the growth in the 1930s does probably reflect that this is shortly after the journal's reboot. In 1921, the Society ceased publishing proceedings and replaced it with the Antiquaries Journal, with aims to reach a wider audience. And in Volume 1, they state they want to contemplate relations of a more intimate kind with the principal societies of the continent, and this exchange journal was the perfect way to do that with their new journal that is specifically focused slightly more widely. So it could be due to that, but we do have some more examples in the letters that I think imply at least that the political circumstances were having an impact on the exchanges. So you will see here, we've got two letters. The letter on the left is dated the 31st of January, 1938, and it is from the Society explaining to the Turkish Historical Society that unfortunately we're not able to agree to an exchange. And now you'll see the next letter is from the 1st of April, 1938, expressing that we wish to reconsider the decision that we had made and actually would quite like to go into exchange with the Turkish Historical Society. The fact that this was clearly agreed and discussed in the Society and then minds changed within a few short months as political tensions increasing, I think is good evidence, or at least it seems logical to me, that the increasing political tensions was having a direct impact on our choice of exchanges. And I can say that we did take this journal up until the mid-1990s, so we do have a very good run of the journal following this exchange. So as with the late 1930s, I've noticed another big increase in correspondence, as you might expect, from 1945. There's some parallels in the speed at which libraries were requesting their back issues to be sent and have continued exchanges, and also how much their infrastructure had been affected by active warfare. So the earliest post-war request I found to reignite the exchange program after the war is from the Landesmuseum Zurich, Switzerland. They sent this on the 12th of September 1945, only 10 days after the war ended. Their library teams were ready to get their journals back and reignite this exchange. Requests from the rest of the continent did come in more slowly. So the American Academy in Rome waited until the following year to request the volumes printed during the war years and all future volumes, which is at the bottom left here. And the Society of Antiquaries of Normandy didn't request their exchange to be reignited until 1959. So I think these are really nice examples of how the situation internationally does impact our journal exchanges and where research is ending up and who has access to information, which is, I find, really significant. So the letters do also hold some evidence of our post-war reconstruction here at the library. Here we have a table listing the Austrian periodicals that were required by the Society post-war. This is particularly interesting to me. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm currently working on a review of exchanges, and I have a spreadsheet that looks quite similar to this, with the last issue received, the comments section, and the address, although I don't need the pre-war address category. And we also hold this list of German wartime archaeological publications. Now, this list was assembled by Dr. William Hassel, who was a librarian working at the Bodleian rather than here. So it's another example of collaborative working between library staff and institutions. I find this list particularly interesting as it shows that the books that we were considering buying, because many of the books on this list we actually didn't end up acquiring. They're not something that we have in our collection, but they do show some of what must have been the process of consideration and acquisitions that were happening at that time. So finally, sorry, Anushka, I have lost a couple of slides in here. So what I was going to say is I did have a picture, because finally the collection of letters has preserved some really interesting material that I won't go into a lot of detail about, but on the back of one of the letters, there's an advertisement for Belgian Airlines, advertising for people to go on holiday in Germany following their outstanding post-war recovery from the 1950s, which is quite soon from the airline, I thought. And also we have lots of advertisements as publications are coming back for those. So we do have the print history side of things as well. So I did think that here, with our colleagues from Spalding and Kelmscott Manor and everyone attending in Burlington House and also online today, that it's an appropriate occasion to share some of the vital evidence of collaboration among colleagues working far and wide within library collections, journals, publications, and all of these interconnected fields that we're part of. It might have become clear the work doesn't represent a full survey, but the letters will in due course be catalogued as part of our institutional archive and available to researchers. But before that's possible, I'm really pleased to have been given the opportunity to share some of them with you today that I've been working on a day-to-day library basis. So thank you very much.
Hello, I'm so sorry my slides jumped over yours. But what's really lovely is that people can see Keller in this slide if you look closely. So I think that's a nice link across the two papers. So good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here today, and we're so excited to be involved with the Collections and Research Day here at the Society of Antiquaries. So I am Michelle Johansson, Learning and Outreach Manager, and what I'm going to do for you this morning is provide an overview of how this society has used collections and research to inform its outreach programme during 2025. And the reason I'm sticking to 2025 is I don't want to bore everybody who was here last year by repeating material from last year. So I'm keeping very closely to what we've been doing in the past year. And that's mainly as part of the Magna Carta 1225 project that's been supported by a range of funders, including the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the law firm Farrer & Co. This one-year project is sharing our building and collections with people of all ages through open days, late events, learning workshops, and also a temporary exhibition, which took place in this very room from July to September. And I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hands if they did come here and see that exhibition over the summer. So for those of you that didn't see it, the room was transformed with green lighting, trees in the centre of the room, foliage everywhere, and that is because we had on display a Halesowen Abbey scroll, which includes the Charter of the Forest alongside Magna Carta. And so we leaned into this Charter of the Forest area of Magna Carta, and I'll talk about why that matters shortly. So the preparation for the exhibition kicked off in April this year when we worked with the charity Classics for All on a translation project. Many of you will know Classics for All. They're a charity who does absolutely wonderful work to ensure students in state schools are supported to study the classics, including learning Latin. So we set 50 students at 6 schools across Britain to work to translate 20 clauses taken from our 1225 Magna Carta and the accompanying Charter of the Forest. The students' translations then featured in our exhibition zine or catalogue and information packs for visitors. So for the young people involved, not only were they doing something that was quite different in learning terms, but they also knew that the outcomes of their classroom learning was going to have an impact more widely and beyond the classroom. And what you can see on the screen there is some of the students' work. So the teachers shared with us their annotations, the process of the translation. And what I really loved about that particular kind of sub-project within Magna Carta 1225 was the way that the young people responded to it, because what they said is that usually in the classroom, they're working with classical texts. So when they do translation, it's using classical texts, and it was really exciting for them to work with a different kind of material. So this is a quote from one of the students at Durham Johnston School in the Northeast, who said, "I really enjoyed translating the Magna Carta because of its important historical significance and just generally being interested in what such a manuscript actually says." And here you can see some of the students from Durham Johnston School. You can see them dressed up in our extremely authentic dressing up clothes that we use for open days and also sometimes for school learning sessions. But what you can't see, because a designer did this to my presentation, across the bottom there was, I promise you, a table covered with notes, with documents that they could explore. So it was a learning session that ended up with a bit of dressing up and a photo opportunity at the end. So most of the Classics for All students who were involved in that project early on in Magna Carta 1225 later visited here from, as I say, all over England to view the exhibition and help trial our new Magna Carta 1225 schools workshops. But that's to jump ahead. We've still got some more to cover first from earlier in the project. So meanwhile, from April-May time, our volunteers were getting immersed in a collections and research project of their own ahead of the Magna Carta 1225 exhibition launch in July. So we had 6 research workshops involving 10 volunteers, and between them they produced a range of outcomes inspired by our collections and also the exhibition content. So they put together an exhibition zine. They worked on 2 glossaries, which gave some context to both the charters we had on display during the summer, Magna Carta and Charter of the Forest, which, as you can imagine, had some very unfamiliar terms in them. So we produced 2 glossaries that were available for any visitors to help them to understand and unlock the meaning of those documents. And they also produced 2 information folders. And I have to say, one of the proudest moments for me of the exhibition is when we had a couple of visitors here from Westminster Cathedral, and they spent hours going through these information folders that have been produced by the volunteers and saying how wonderful and they should have things like this at Westminster Cathedral. So I thought that was a nice kind of endorsement of what our volunteers have produced. Inspired, as I say, by our collections, but trying to funnel those collections out into the wider community and people of all ages, abilities and levels of English as well, because when we have open days and exhibitions, because of where we're located, we tend to have a lot of tourist traffic. So we'll have people visiting who aren't from this country, don't have English as their first language. And so it can be quite complicated for them to navigate an exhibition that includes quite dense text or information. So it's good to have that information broken down in a range of ways so that everybody can access it. What our volunteers also did, a number of them, 6 of them, and also 1 staff member, Becky, they developed spotlight talks. So their collections and research work meant that our volunteers were ready to deliver a really meaningful experience for the 5,400 visitors who came to our Magna Carta 1225 exhibition across the 27 days that it ran during the summer. And so they delivered more than 30 spotlight talks on a range of themes, including the barons and the knights, heraldry, and women and the charter. And that was important too, because in the exhibition itself, women weren't very well represented. And so to have volunteers here who were able to talk about the female experience was really important. And all of the feedback made it very plain that our visitors very much enjoyed these talks. So you can see an extract here from our visitors book, and at the top, you've got Hilary there from Sydney, Australia, saying great talks by volunteers. And then also further down, I particularly like Jay and Jenny from Nashville saying, thank you for preserving history. I mean, to me, that is just such a magnificent commendation of the work that we did in the Magna Carta 1225 exhibition. We've also got another extract here. Actually, I'll stay on this page just briefly to say, you can see the range of locations that people visited from here too, can't you? So we've got the very glamorous Sydney, Las Vegas, Nashville, alongside Windsor, St Albans and Leicester, which are also very glamorous too, but maybe not quite as glamorous. But yeah, so we did have people from all over Britain and all over the world visiting the exhibition, which was just completely fantastic. And then again, you'll see here at the kind of halfway down the page, wonderful volunteers to explain exhibition. And it's just an important reminder of how it's not enough to have the collections and the research alone. You need to be able to share that or disseminate that information more widely through talks and also having that in-person response, because I have been to exhibitions before where there are no staff and no volunteers on duty, and it is just the cases there. And I think it's good to have people to speak and to be able to judge and gauge what the visitors want to know. So as you started to see, as I say, there's a global audience that we were welcoming here to the Society during the summer. We recorded visitors from Taiwan, Japan, Malaysia, India, Spain, Italy, Peru, New Zealand, etc., and many, of course, from the USA. The exhibition came to a triumphant end with a late event that was co-produced by a team of young Londoners, some of whom can be seen on the right here. And of course, we had a wrap party for our fantastic volunteers, who between them gave over 1,000 hours of their time to supporting the exhibition. But Magna Carta 1225 didn't end with the closure of the exhibition. We're now delivering a new workshop for secondary school pupils inspired by the collections research that took place ahead of the exhibition run. And this workshop places our library and museum collections front and centre in the learning experience. So what you see on this slide here is a photograph from one of these trial sessions that took place in the last couple of months. And the student said here, a Key Stage 5 student, it was very interactive with a variety of sources, each with its own unique interest. The tour of the Society and its history was amazing. And what you can see is 4 different groups of students at 4 different tables, and each of those tables has a different thematic focus. And also what you can see on each of those tables there is that the tables are loaded up with materials from our collections. So these aren't copies, these are original materials, and this gives the students a really authentic research experience. And in fact, The third table, you can see that actually third along, there's a group of students who are approximating a 20th century research experience by looking at secondary materials, including pamphlets and books published in the 20th century. And for students today who are used to digital sources or just brief extracts of things, that's not only quite challenging, but also, I think, incredibly important and rewarding, because they're reflecting on historiography, they're reflecting on the making of history. So they're not just getting insight into the thematic focus of the session, they're also beginning to understand what historians have done throughout history to try to record and document the past, and how that's changed over time with new technologies and so on. We also, a couple of weeks ago, allowed or encouraged 18 sixth form students to take over this building, one of our open days, for Kids in Museums Takeover Day. So we had 4 teams of students. We organised them into the kind of teams that you would see in a typical learning or library or cultural institution. So there were created these 4 teams, which were operations, collections, marketing and programmes. And then they worked to deliver a really inspiring open day for our visitors. And you can see all the young people doing the cross fingers there, which is for the lottery. We're doing a brief marketing photo opportunity there. And the reason they've all got their backs to camera is because of safeguarding. So that's why we can't see them properly. But I promise you, they didn't have their backs to me throughout the session. They were fantastic students, really engaged and really excited by the chance to take over the building. And they did a print block show and tell, they did a lost charter drama, and they also did spotlight talks on some of the paintings that you'll see in the room around us, partly because those paintings are mainly oil on wood. And the theme of the day was Voice of the Trees, again, the Charter of the Forest theme. And so what they were thinking about is interpreting that very broadly and thinking about how the trees still have a voice for us today through the literal making of history, like print blocks, wood blocks, and also paintings that are helping to preserve the past, but through the use of wood. So they had a marvellous day, and as you can see, our visitors did as well. We had nearly 100 visitors on the day, and they really thoroughly enjoyed the different perspective that the young people brought to our collections through their research across a couple of training days they attended earlier in the month. But it's not all and only about Magna Carta. We are also continuing to deliver the school sessions that we developed during our last learning and outreach programme, Sensing History. And this includes our popular Discovering the Romans session for primary school pupils. Again, we make quite a resourceful use of the collections. So the pupils search for traces in the building and collections of the Romans, traces that have been left behind. So this is a dialogue between past and present, rather than, for example, looking at Roman life or Roman conquest, etc., etc. So it's very Society of Antiquaries in its concept. It's very much about material culture. And again, we have 4 sets of materials for the students to explore once they've done a tour of the building. But in case you're not familiar with these images here and what they represent, on the top, on the left there, we've got a Roman lamp believed to have belonged to Julius Caesar that's on display in the Fellows Room, and the young people get a chance to see that. You can also see a line of books with our Lamp of Knowledge stamped on the binding there. And of course, the Lamp of Knowledge originally believed to be Roman, but then discovered to be medieval. So again, this dialogue between past and present, our ideas and our knowledge and understanding of the past changing as new knowledge comes to light. Then we've got the egg and dart design there in the plasterwork in the ceiling here and also in the corridor, which is very exciting for the young people because they can see a dart and see an egg and then start to understand the way that these Roman designs have informed modern architecture or modern Victorian architecture. And then finally at the bottom there, an object that I particularly like to draw people's attention to because it's the Novio Magians dining chair. It's named after a Roman settlement discovered in Kent in the Victorian period. It's belonged to a Victorian dining club and it's an Elizabethan dining chair. So you've got nearly the whole of history there mashed up into one humble item that's just hanging around on the stairs as you go up towards the library. So I always like to draw the students' attention to that as well. And it's been a really popular session with the year 4s in particular, who we've been working with. So they're usually age about 8, and they get a lot out of having the opportunity to look at original materials and do their own collections research using sources, including drawings. So we invariably get out a set of drawings for them to look at, and they get to draw their own Roman objects using these drawings. And this is my favourite quotation from the session earlier this year. "I think this experience was amazing. Now I want to be a historian when I'm older." And that's exactly what our Learning and Outreach programme is all about here at the Society of Antiquaries. It is based very firmly in our collections, which is why I wanted to present at Collections and Research Day. But it's also all about engaging the historians of the future, whether that's for professional historians or people just having a love of history. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Keller and Michelle. Anushka, do we want everybody up here, or shall we pass the mic?
Wouldn't mind coming back up.
Sorry.
And then if anyone has any questions, then Rhiannon will hand it up.
Great. Has anybody got any questions for Keller and Michelle? In which case, I will start off with a question, first of all, for Keller. And this is, I appreciate, quite a heavy question, but do you think that you could trace sort of what's happening globally through the subscriptions to the antiquaries, you know, later in the 20th century, for example? Now, as you review the subscriptions, do you think that they reflect what's happening more widely? For example, do you notice particular countries are producing less journals and less publications as they sort of face strife? And do you think could you say a little bit about that?
So I think the answer to that is yes, almost certainly. One of the big things that we're grappling with at the library at the moment is that quite a lot of publications have gone online because of COVID, and that's really been a push globally to push journals online, which means that our print exchange program has fewer print serials coming in and the print exchanges are ending. So I think everything that we're doing is reflecting of our current global situation, even if that isn't what's on my mind while I'm checking through our current exchanges. I think it's inherent to what we have, and the emails that I'm sending at the moment, I imagine will be very reflective of the fact they were sent in 2025.
And I've got also a question for Michelle. And talking about sort of the digital, really, in this sort of increasingly digital age, and we're all thinking about how we want to digitize our collections and make our collections sort of available globally online. Could you just talk a little bit about how and why it's so important for objects, for especially school children and indeed lifelong learners, why it is so important for people to actually engage with the physical, and why historical objects matter so much in the learning and outreach programs?
Thanks, Alex. And I'll face the room rather than you, even though it feels a bit rude, but just so that I can speak into the microphone. I'm really glad you asked that question, because it gives me a chance to talk about something that I feel very strongly about, is that a lot of young people feel that, I mean, their concentration is getting very scattered, and the use of mobile phones is very prevalent. And what I've noticed happening with young people, particularly when you introduce a learning activity for younger young people into a session, is that they will spend hours drawing. And teachers tell me that that is because they don't get the chance to draw in school. Art is being really cut in most schools. They don't get the chance to do anything creative. And what we find on our open days, when we have drop-in art workshops, you will have young people who will sit there for sometimes 2 or 3 hours drawing, and the parents will be sitting there twiddling their thumbs or looking at their phones, but the kids are drawing. And I think to have something tangible and concrete and something to hold and something that slows everybody down is really, really valued. And I think it's the same with the chance to look at concrete or kind of tactile objects, to handle them and to explore them and to see the world in 3D or in kind of, you know, in the real world, rather than through this very odd interface that we so often engage with the world in or through, I think is something that's really, really valuable. And it seems to be much appreciated both by the students and the teachers. You know, there's a sense of being able to slow down once you're in the room, look at these objects and explore them. And it does take a bit of time to do. And I think quite often the teachers find it harder than the pupils to sit quietly and look at the things they feel that they should be engaging or interacting constantly through a session, because that's what one is used to doing. But in fact, when you have the time to start looking at something, a document, it might feel overwhelming to begin with, but once you get absorbed in it, you are absorbed in it. And I think it's a real testimony to how valuable it is to look at material culture and material objects face to face, without glass and without a screen.
Great, thank you. And we've got a question just down
I've got
here.
a question here. My name's David. I'm one of the volunteers who works with Michelle and also with Keller. And I would just like to say it's enormously rewarding working with you. And I have to thank you for all the help that you give us and the opportunity. One question I did have is, I've been doing this for a couple of years. And when we started, there were a few people coming in. We had some open days and then more and more people. And the outreach program now is quite extensive in terms of getting in both visitors who come in from all over the world, people who are going to the RA, who drop in, who've never seen the place before and thought, what is that building? And coming in and seeing the library and loving it. I would like to ask you and perhaps our president whether the outreach program and the influx of new people is something that is generally appreciated by our fellows.
That's a very good question. Martin, do you want to?
I think it is very much. Occasionally, I had one fellow about 18 months ago who came up and moaned about why are we letting children in. This was at tea on a Thursday, and the rest of the fellows around the room we completely disagree with that, and we think it's actually fantastically important. Clearly, we've got a balance to strike between our role as a centre where people can come and use the library for research, but at the same time, if we don't have young people coming in and taking advantage of the work that Michelle and her team and volunteers like you have been doing, we won't have people working in the library and doing research in 20 and 30 years' time. This, for me, is the lifeblood of bringing people, new people in to appreciate and love what we all love and appreciate here.
Thank you very much. And I think actually one of the points I heard the other day was we're one of the few learned societies whose membership numbers are actually going up. And as Martin just said, we need new members and younger members. When I've left this earthly plane, I hope that there will be sort of new generations of people using the library in our collection. So that was a great question. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Over here.
Hello, I've got a question about the library research. So have you had any insights or reflections on the soft power of the antiquaries during conflict?
I think that might be a question for Keller. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it does seem, and the problem is that I'm reading letters that are to us. So it does seem to me like the antiquaries does have quite a lot of soft power, and especially the period I'm reading is early to mid 20th century. But these are all letters that are written to us. So it does make sense that they are quite effusive and encouraging about the work the society is doing and the publication. In the cases like L'Anthropologie, where they are then republishing notes about us in their journal, that does make us seem like we do have quite a lot of soft power. But I would be cautious to base that just on these letters for that reason, because if you want something from us, you probably are going to be nice to us.
Great, thank you so much. So if we could all just give a round of applause to Keller and Michelle. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce our next two speakers, and they are from our site at Kelmscott Manor. So Dr. Cathy Haslam, FSA, is curator at Kelmscott Manor and is a specialist in William Morris and the arts and craft movement. She has worked in curatorial roles at institutions including the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Museum of the Home, which is formerly the Jeffrey Museum, and Blackwell, the Arts and Crafts House. Since 2012, she's been responsible for the collection, displays and exhibitions at Kelmscott Manor and was a member of the project board for the Manor's recent £6 million project, Kelmscott and Morris, Past, Present and Future, with particular responsibility for research, presentation and interpretation. And Dr. Hannah Britton is the Learning and Outreach Officer at Kelmscott Manor. She's been in post for 4.5 years, building on the Manor's engagement programmes from the ground up. She started her career in museums at the Wordsworth Trust in Grasmere, following doctoral research into the spatial poetics of Romantic poets William Wordsworth, John Keats and Lord Byron. So thank you and welcome Kathy and Hannah.
Good morning, everybody. Hannah and I are both delighted to be talking to you today about the Society's NLHF-funded Threads of the Past project at Kelmscott Manor. I'll be speaking first for about 15 minutes, and I'll cover context, significance, and process before passing over to Hannah. 2019 saw the commencement of the Society of Antiquaries' £6 million Kelmscott and Morris Past, Present and Future project, which Alex just mentioned, at Kelmscott Manor in rural Oxfordshire, the former country home of Victorian polymath William Morris, of whom more in a minute. And you can see the manor on the screen. The capital works incorporated all aspects of the site, from upgraded drainage and visitor facilities to a new build learning barn, to the representation and reinterpretation of the manor's historic interiors. The project marked a step change for the manor, both in terms of its offer and future sustainability. The New Look Manor would reflect Morris's daughter May's intention that its future owners should, quote, keep together the relics and keep the atmosphere of life here going for many and many years. The images you can see here are the first room that the visitor experiences when they come to Kelmscott, the old hall, and you can see it pre-KMPPF at the top, and then underneath is the room as it's experienced now. The revivification of atmosphere was key to our approach. Architectural features and decorative schemes were reinstated in each of the rooms, and museological elements that had crept in from the 1960s onwards were removed. The redistribution of the collection was informed by a research process that had been ongoing for several years, during which a myriad of visual and written sources had been collated and interrogated, and I should mention here my invaluable volunteer research group who did sterling work. The lead evidential source was the memorandum appended to May Morris's will, essentially a list of objects and their locations in the house. In using this as the starting point for the furnishing scheme of each space, we hoped to do full justice to her intentionality in selecting the object she did to remain in the house after her death, to reflect her father's life and work. In so doing, she formulated the collection our visitors enjoy today. There was one notable exception, however, and that was the tapestry room, where changes were limited to essential structural works and the refurnishing of the space in line with research findings. In order to achieve a comparable level of decorative accuracy to the other interiors, extensive architectural interventions were required, and the remedial conservation of the 17th century Sampson tapestries and their reconfiguration was necessary. The combined cost of these aspects precluded them from being incorporated into the past, present, and future project. And this is the room as it has remained until we closed at the end of this season. And so it was that the Threads of the Past project took shape and is now underway. A project that would not only enable us to undertake the appropriate architectural alterations to the tapestry room and the conservation and reconfiguration of its tapestries in order to recapture more emphatically the atmosphere of this key space, but also to develop and deliver a related programme of learning and engagement activities. And the architectural works are taking place as we speak. The most prominent change will be the reinstatement of a timber partition at the north end of the room, which you can see here, minus the partition, obviously, to recreate the adjoining closet, known during the Morris family's time as the bachelor's bedroom. In order to accommodate the tapestries post-conservation, alterations to other features that were introduced in the 1960s, skirting boards, architraves and coving, for example, will also be addressed. And I'm going to look briefly now at the history and significance both of the room and its tapestries before handing over to Hannah, who will be talking about the Threads activity programme. As time is so short, I've been selective about aspects of the broader historical and cultural context. In 1871, designer, craftsman, writer, conservationist and political campaigner William Morris, who you can see on the left, and pre-Raphaelite painter-poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti on the right, signed a joint 3-year tenancy of the former farmhouse recently elevated to manorial status deep in the Oxfordshire countryside. From this date, Kelmscott Manor's tapestry room, originally a bedroom, took on added significance. During his 3-year association with Kelmscott, Rossetti adapted it as a studio space, referring on several occasions to the tapestries, though in less than even lukewarm terms, although he did recognise their historical value. He writes to his mother in 1871, "My studio here is a delightful room, all hung round with old tapestry. It gives in grim sequence the history of Samson, and is certainly not the liveliest of company. Indeed, I should cover it all up if I knew how. To take it down would not do, as it might go to pieces or get moth-eaten." And what you can see here is probably the grimmest of the tapestries, which is Samson having his eyes removed. And this photograph is one of a series taken of our tapestries that we commissioned in order to produce accurate to scale reproductions of the tapestries in order to minimize any impact on the visitor experience whilst the originals undergo conservation. Subsequently, the room functioned as both William Morris's principal workspace and as an informal sitting room, acting during the evenings as the setting for the Morrises' family and social life. Contemporary accounts conjure an effortlessly multifunctional space that witnessed the varied activities and preoccupations of the Morrises as the years passed, and itself became the subject for creative responses on multiple occasions. Tapestry, which he declared to be the noblest of all the weaving arts, made an impact on William Morris early in life. In recalling the first example he'd come across as a boy, he later declared, "Yes, that was more than upholstery, believe me." By the late 1870s, he had determined to revive the art, which he believed had practically perished, yet another victim to mechanisation. Morris & Co. went on to produce some of the preeminent examples of late 19th and early 20th century handloom woven tapestries, and you can see one of them here from the very famous Holy Grail series. The series of 5 mid-17th century Flemish tapestries depicting the life of Samson were already in the manor when Morris arrived at Kelmscott. This is another one. This one is the feast at Timnath. They were key to the ambience he so valued at the manor, acting as a nexus between past and present, and he described them at length in Gossip About an Old House on the Upper Thames, an article published towards the end of his life, in which he describes the old house with the informed eye of an antiquary and the warmth of long-standing affection. Writing of the tapestries that they were never great works of art, and now, when all the bright colours have faded out, and nothing is left but the indigo blues and greys and the warm yellow browns, they look better, I think, than they were meant to look. At any rate, they make the walls a very pleasant background for the living people who haunt the room and give an air of romance which nothing else would quite do. Morris's appreciation for the beguiling qualities age had endowed them with is also expressed in his novel News from Nowhere, in which the indelible impression is one of unassuming continuity. They were, quote, "originally of no artistic value, faded into pleasant grey tones which harmonised thoroughly well with the quiet of the place, and which would have been ill supplanted by brighter and more striking decoration." Morris recognised them as representing the middle to lower end of 17th century tapestry production, with their relatively coarse weave, inconsistency of detail, and slightly clumsy rendering of figures. When originally installed in the tapestry room, probably in the late 17th or early 18th century, and therefore acquired second-hand, the tapestries were adapted to fit the space. This necessitated cutting, folding, and shortening them to differing degrees. 2 were even cut up and sections reunited so as to fit the dimensions of the southeast corner of the room. And you can see in the slide on the right, one section of a tapestry which has been inserted between the main field of another tapestry and its column then attached at the outer edge in order to create a single textile of the appropriate dimensions. It was a pragmatic solution, as was the decision to nail another section of the feast at Timnath to the reverse of the door through to Morris's bedroom, which you can see here. In March 1896, Morris commissioned friend and leading art photographer Frederick Evans to create a photographic portrait of the manor, working alongside him to achieve the shots he wanted. The tapestry room was the only space to be photographed from several different perspectives, providing a complete record of how the tapestries were hung at that date and denoting the room's importance for Morris. And each of the last 2 photographs that you've seen are from that series taken by Evans. The tapestries remained thus until 1965. Kelmscott Manor had come into the ownership of the Society of Antiquaries in 1960. Although of all his homes, this was the one with which he felt the deepest emotional engagement, William Morris had never owned it. The lease having been renewed for over 40 years, his widow Jane finally purchased the estate in 1913, nearly 20 years after his death and just a year before her own. She left it to their younger daughter May, who made provision for it in her will, leaving it to Oxford University. May died in 1938 and the university assumed ownership with that set of contents which I mentioned earlier that appeared in her memorandum, but for a litany of reasons had decided by 1960 to extricate itself from the restrictive terms of her will. The manor then passed to the Society of Antiquaries as residuary legatee. It was by then in a state of extreme dilapidation, and the Society embarked on a 5-year programme of conservation and consolidation. It was during this period that the decision was taken to reverse the historical adaptations the Samson tapestries had undergone and present them instead as they would have been when new. And you can see here, I'll just backtrack a couple of slides and you might recognise part of the figure in the centre there. So you can see him as being the left-hand element of the figure in the tapestry on the screen now. The partition dividing the main room from its adjoining closet was removed, and the tapestries were reconfigured by reuniting the various elements that had been historically separated in adapting them to fit the space. It was a well-intentioned decision informed by the conservation practices of its day, but one which undermined the tapestry room's integrity as a domestic interior that had evolved organically over its preceding centuries of occupation, and decontextualised the tapestries from the specificity of their socio-historical function. For the Threads of the Past project, the Frederick Evans photographs, along with documentary sources and drawings, paintings and other photographs spanning the period 1898 to 1921 in particular, have informed the approach to both the tapestry's conservation and the design of the new timber partition that will recreate 2 rooms that both generations of the Turner family, who built the house's lower farm in around 1600, and the Morris family knew, the tapestry room itself and its adjoining bachelor's bedroom. What I've done here is place together 2 of Frederick Evans's photographs to show, in effect, the north end of the room and how, when our project is complete, those tapestries will butt up to conceal the bachelor's bedroom. It was something of a secret hidden place. Where they join is the outer edge of a doorway through to that former closet. As Helen Wilde, Senior Curator responsible for European textiles at National Museum Scotland, writes, the value of the set lies in its recorded history and its current setting. William Morris clearly saw the Samson tapestries as part of the historic fabric of the house. Given Morris's key role in reviving interest in the medium in this country, the Samson tapestries have a curious and quite unique place in the historiography of tapestry in Britain. And I'd just like to conclude, for those of you who might be questioning our decision to reverse the 1960s interventions, by saying that there was a sound conservation imperative to do so. In 1965, the tapestries were cleaned and repaired. Treatment included relining with hessian, the execution of extensive areas of stitched repair, overpainting of both lining and, in some instances, the tapestry surfaces themselves, and infill to restore missing detail. Much of this extensive work was rudimentary, and over the years has itself created new issues. So you can see some of the many holes in the tapestries and some of the failing stitching on that slide, and some of the very rudimentary repairs and painted hessian on this one. And my final slide. All of the tapestries are structurally unsound, with numerous splits and areas of loss, extensive areas of failed or failing conservation stitching, problematic overpainting, friable hessian linings, and corrosion from historic nails that were used to secure the tapestries in place. Other than light surface cleaning, they have undergone no treatment since the 1960s and require urgent remedial conservation. It's an ambitious undertaking, and one that will create a space which is experientially very different and, we hope, powerful in its recaptured ambience. Thank you.
So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time sharing with you the ideas that underpin our learning and engagement program for Threads of the Past. It has been a rare and extraordinary opportunity to develop a program around the conservation of these remarkable historic objects and around the space that they have created for almost 400 years. The backgrounds they have provided, as William Morris described it, for the living people who haunt the room, whose lives they have witnessed, inspired, and enriched. Textile metaphors have long been used to express the complexity of human lived experience and our capacity for making and creativity. Through Threads of the Past, this metaphor comes to life at Kelmscott Manor, as we invite our audiences to step inside the stories of the tapestry room and to help us to weave the next chapter. So I want to reflect on 3 themes that have shaped the program. The first is value. This is at the heart of the questions we ask of and about the tapestries, and of the stories we tell about how they were made, how they came to Kelmscott Manor, how they impacted the people who lived here, and how we care for them today. The tapestries are objects of status and wealth. When the Turners first purchased them to clothe the walls of the room that they would give a name to, this sense of value was likely at the forefront of their decision-making. Just like the coat of arms that adorns both fireplaces in the 1960s extension to the house, the tapestries speak of the shift from Thamesside farmhouse to Cotswold Manor. Yet, as Kathy has mentioned, the cutting, folding, and reorganizing of the sequence tells us that the tapestries were not commissioned for the room. They were bought either second-hand or off the shelf. The record of adaptation that we read in the fabric of the tapestries is an important part of their story, revealing a slight unraveling at the edges of their performance of prosperity. When Morris and Rossetti took on the tenancy of the manor in 1871, they were both enamored of the tapestry room, but had a rather different sense of the tapestry's worth. As Kathy shared just now, adapting this principal bedroom to become his studio, Rossetti found the grim sequence they depicted from the biblical story of Samson overwhelming, and would have taken them down were it not for the risk that they would fall to pieces. He writes with jubilation or relief in the summer of 1873 of having got all my drawings hung over the tapestry in my new studio, where they look very well and improve the tapestry wonderfully by shutting out its hideousness and preserving its fine tone. Kathy has spoken of Morris's affection for the tapestries, not as great works of art, but for the atmosphere they created, their sense of history, of the past tangibly touching the present moment. And like the tapestry-clad room that imprinted itself on Morris's psyche as a boy, this space surely influenced his decision to revive the dying art of tapestry weaving in the UK. Tangible and intangible value, the value of the idea of the object, the value of what it would inspire. To move to today, another perspective on the tapestry's worth unfolds through the conservation process, the cost of preserving these objects for future generations, and why we might believe in doing this. One of our key aims in the Learning and Engagement programme is to transform public understanding of the tapestry room, enabling our audiences to reflect on the tapestry's past and their future, and to answer the question, what value or meaning might they have for us today? The second theme that runs through the programme is process. It is unusual and exciting and sometimes challenging to build a programme around objects in flux, objects that are absent or inaccessible to the audiences you are engaging with. Although our photographic reproductions have done a remarkable job in creating the illusion that the tapestries are still hanging on the walls. The tapestries are narrative objects, but the story we explore focuses less on the tale you can read in their figures and scenes than on the one that unfolds in their surfaces. With the help of esteemed tapestry weaver Chrissy Freeth, Kathy and I can now better read the long story of the making of the tapestries, can imagine the many hands that wove them and the greater or lesser skills they employed, the master weavers and the apprentices. Working with our conservation studios has helped us to understand both the history of deterioration that is visible in holes and patches, loose warp threads, marks and stains, and the story of repair that the conservators are currently writing. The judicious stitches that are restoring structural integrity to the tapestries, but will not make them look like new. And mending is not the only process taking place. As Kathy mentioned, as we speak, architectural work is being undertaken in the tapestry room to restore the partition in order that the tapestries can be rehung in the configuration in which Morris and generations of turners before him knew them. Because of these significant changes, it was important for us that our learning and engagement programme involved working with groups over a long period of time, such that they would be able to see the conservation process at work and experience the transformation of the space. So our workshops for A-level students will take place across the school year, while our work with targeted community groups involves a regular series of workshops rather than one-off visits. The idea of mending that does not disguise almost 400 years of use is also important for our community engagement with mental health recovery groups and other support groups, where we can use the conservation process to reflect on what mending or repair might have taken place in our own lives and the value of our own stories. And the third and final theme is making. The tapestries are a record of makers and making in myriad forms, from the designer of the cartoons, to the spinners and dyers of the threads, to the deft hands and interpreting eyes of the weavers, to the makers who have sat in the tapestry room for generations, surrounded by these handmade objects, and making by hand themselves. Making is at the heart of the Learning and Engagement programme and an integral part of the opportunities we are creating for our audiences. Learning new skills and developing creativity and imaginative making in response to the tapestries is part of how we explore what they might mean for us today, how they might continue to inspire us, and the legacy they have now and into the future. I will show you a different slide. Work has already begun to explore these many threads through public engagement events during Make and Mend May, a month dedicated to exploring the ideas of creativity and sustainability through workshops, activities, and a repair cafe. This month will launch a whole season of activities in 2026 as we dive deeper into the stories of the tapestries and respond creatively to them. In October, I began work with Age UK Oxfordshire, welcoming a group of 11 participants to the Manor for a series of creative and skills-based workshops that will take place monthly until April. They were the last group to see the tapestry room in its post-1960s configuration, and they will be among the first to see it transformed. This partnership aims to support individuals experiencing isolation, bereavement, or other challenges that pose barriers to engaging with others and with culture and heritage. And the images that you can see on the screen are taken from our November session, in which we learnt the art of cording, a skill that requires at least 2 people working together. And we made our own threads, including some inspired by the colours of the tapestries. More community groups, schools, and visitors will get involved in the project next season. And together we will produce a community-made tapestry, a creative response to the many threads of the story of the tapestry room. We are Morris's living people who haunt the room now. And it is my hope that as we bring the tapestries from background to centre stage, we will discover just how much they have enriched and can inspire our lives.
Thank you both so much for your talks. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you. I do remember that there was a lot of discussion about the extent of restoration in the 1960s, and it was powerfully driven by the amount of funds available, as today, no doubt. But I think more would have been done if it had been possible, but it wasn't always thus.
To respond?
I don't know whether you're aware, Martin, that we do have correspondence in our archive which refers to the Society's request to have the tapestries conserved, and the conservator that they approached was actually very dismissive of doing anything at all. So the fact that the Society persisted and did have a certain amount of conservation work undertaken was certainly testament to the Society, because the conservator certainly was not terribly willing at the time.
Yes, I think the person concerned was more accustomed to really high quality tapestries and was perhaps the wrong person. Who knows?
Great, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? No, I think we're running a little behind schedule, so we'll wrap up on this session and say thank you both so much again. And to introduce our final 2 speakers of this morning's session, and they are both from Spalding Gentlemen's Society. So Eleanor Chad is Collections and Facilities Officer at SGS and serves as peer mentor for the Heritage Associates Programme. Over the past 3 years, she has led the first whole-scale review of the Society's museum holdings since the early 20th century, and is currently coordinating the creation of a new, fully accessible collections catalogue to bring together the Society's museum, library and archive holdings in a freely accessible form for the first time. And she's joined by Dr. Dustin Frazier-Wood, FSA, who's Head of Collections and Operations at the Society and Senior Lecturer in Cultural Heritage at the University of Roehampton. Dustin's research and professional practice focuses on the history of antiquarianism, the history of collections and collecting, and the provincial Enlightenment. So welcome and thank you very much.
Grand, thank you. Apologies in advance. We're going to try and cover a lot of ground at a rapid clip. So ask questions after when we invariably skip things. And the first thing I'm going to do is say that we're going to skip over the first 200 years of SGS's history. The building you see on the left there is where our story begins, built in 1911 in Spalding's Broad Street. It's actually SGS's 5th home. since its foundation in 1710. So 200 years later, they have a museum of their own built to their spec for the first time. There on the right is the museum as it sits today. Very little changed, although you'll notice the cracking masonry on the front. When I arrived at SGS as a researcher, it was a time of very significant change, but also a time when the society was taking stock. SGS had not undergone a significant recuration of its holdings since about 1962, when some additions were built. Public access was strictly by appointment only, and those visitors had to be accompanied by, and I quote, a male member. Engagement was limited to about 12 lectures a year and the occasional Heritage Open Day. Collections care was very much a passive concern. There was no research agenda, and there was no central collections database or even a complete set of hand lists. So everything we're talking about is since 2014. The society also faced challenges in managing its collections and giving access. The building was completely inaccessible due to overcrowding. Some of the walkways were under 18 inches across due to crowding with pottery and masonry. The bit in orange that you can see on the ground floor plan here was failing, sinking into collapsing drains. There was no back of house space. Everything was in the galleries. There was a very limited volunteering program, and I count about one person in that. There was a very low level of public awareness, and there was low, perhaps no, perceived public benefit beyond the membership and those who turned up to lectures. So there was quite a challenge. But the tide began to change in about 2014, and that's where the story really begins. And that is the year the Society received museum accreditation, after the work of some really pioneering volunteers and trustees who have since retired or passed away. In 2015 was the first public exhibition since shortly after the building's opening in 1911. And that was of a manuscript by our founder, Morris Johnson II, also a founding member of the Society of Antiquaries. And in 2016, the first grant for conservation for a set of then unknown William Stukeley drawings of garden designs. The next few years were taken up with figuring out quite what to do. The trustees realized they were at a turning point, and I see one of them chuckling at me from across the room. You will meet Ian Holt, our curator, later. And that raised a number of possibilities, which were terrifying, quite frankly, in their extent and scale. And so we took some time to consider. In 2019, finally, a strategic plan was launched, as well as the Fenland Heritage Network, the Society's first concerted attempt to reach out and rebuild connections with other societies that had been part of its founding vision. In 2020, hot on the heels of lockdowns, we took the then major step of acquiring a second site to begin thinning the galleries and providing space for conservation, digitization, and volunteering. Shortly after that, we extended in 21 to some regular public open hours. This was truly cataclysmic for many, but it worked very well for the public. We went from 3 hours a week on a Wednesday afternoon to, in January 2022, 30 hours a week, 5 days, and our first full-time employee, Eleanor, who will shortly be speaking to you. Before that point, we had an assistant librarian who had cataloged for 3 hours a week, and a caretaker who lived next door, who opened the building. Two things I want to highlight before I hand over to Eleanor, though, are some major activities that shape what we are currently going through. One of those is the award of designated outstanding collection status by the Arts Council in 2024 for SGS's original collection. And that is approximately, and it is very approximately, 5,000 museum, library, and archive holdings gathered between the Society's foundation in 1710 and its first reconstitution or reshaping in 1814. That number continues to grow. I think we're now pushing about 6,000 as things keep coming out of the woodwork, largely thanks to Eleanor's work. This is the result of 3 generations of researchers over 10 years of research and publications, at the end of which a 3-year deep dive into material object research and rounds of applications to the Arts Council. When designation was awarded, we had actually applied for designation on the grounds that the original collection was an essential resource for the history of the provincial Enlightenment, simply because it does reveal quite a lot about the way that people living outside London engaged with the wider world in the first half of the 18th century. And we're delighted when the award came back in 3 categories. That is the history of antiquarianism, the history of museums and collecting, and the history of the provincial Enlightenment. History of antiquarianism is fairly obvious, given that many of our founding members were antiquaries and exchanged quite frequently with the society here. The award of designation for the history of museums and collecting comes from the fact of the, quite frankly, outstanding set of documentation and provenance we have, not only for the museum collections, but for the library and the archive, and the many, many iterations of museum interior design, cabinetry, and object and collection taxonomies that still survive. It is perhaps the best documented museum collection in the country from the 18th century. The second turning point is the award of an Arts Council MEND grant, that's Museum Estates and Development Grant, in 2024. After 2 previous applications, 3rd time was a charm, and that allowed the Society to finally address that bit of orange at the back of this plan. And as we speak, the contractors are rolling onto site to start stabilizing the front of the building and demolish everything in orange. We will no longer have it pulling the building down around us or splitting it in half, as you can see in what we rather affectionately call the crack. That gets us to where we are, and I'm going to hand over to Eleanor to talk about the serious work.
Hello, I'm Eleanor. I was actually hired in beginning of 2023 as the first full-time collections-focused employee at SGS. So that's a bit of what I'm going to be talking about today, is all the work I've been doing over the last 3 years. But we're going to start actually with the stuff that was done before I even started. And this was entirely done by volunteers. It started, as Dustin said, with the Society getting its accreditation status, and there was an awful lot of work to do to get full accreditation status. And that included setting up an actual collection system with modes, which meant doing full audits of everything in the museum, looking through all of the hand lists that had accumulated, making sure we knew what we had before we could even move on to anything else. And all of that work was done by Ian and Sharon, who are with us today, who I'm sure you'll have a chance to speak with later if you want to know anything more about this. The caretaker that Dustin mentioned also did an awful lot of work photographing the collections at that time, and I'm exceedingly grateful for that, because it meant that we actually have a representative image of near enough every accessioned piece from the museum collection, which was a fantastic start point. So what I actually first started doing was I started working freelance in October 2022 to start working with that mode system, to actually make templates for accessioned items, to figure out a step-by-step guide so that our volunteers can actually use the mode system. If anyone has ever used modes here, I'm sure you know it's not the friendliest system if you don't know computer databases, and figuring out what we actually had. So that meant finding data from our 4 accession books, which as we worked through, we found out was actually 5 accession books. There was one earlier than we thought we had, and doing all those audits to form a web of data that actually means we know what we have in our collection and what we had moving forward. The first thing that I actually tackled when I started working with the Society proper was figuring out our collection store. As Dustin said, we took on an entirely separate site that was outside of our museum building so that we could actually start doing conservation work and actually handling every object that we have in the collection. And that started with one floor entirely full of shelves and nothing else. And slowly but surely, we have moved every single item from that museum into this store. And as I said, it started with a downstairs space, and as we've taken on Mend, we've now got an upstairs space, a second unit, which I will go on to later as I go through. It was basically figuring out actually how we could store those things in a way that would keep them safe, keep the conditions right, and make sure that we could find things as and when we needed them for display. Because although our museum is currently closed, we are still putting on displays in the second museum site that is in Askerby Hall, which is in Spalding as well. They're letting us co-locate in their building so that we still have some spaces open to the public. This moves on to the scary bit, which was that we packed the entire museum in about 6 months. If you've ever been to us, you'll know how full it was. If you haven't been to us, we have a Matterport scan on our website, a virtual tour. So if you want to see what the museum looked like before, including those orange bits that won't exist as of hopefully a couple of months' time, you'll get an idea. But we did everything that you see in these galleries was still in there as of October 2024. And that meant that we had to get everything out before the end of March 2025. And that is working with me as the only full-time member of staff at that point, about 10 regular volunteers who were doing things with packing and moving, and a couple of our heritage associates, one of which who's at the back of the room today. And I think she's talking a little bit about the Heritage Associates program later. So it'd be interesting to see what she thinks of this. But we found very quickly that really useful boxes were our friends. They are easy to pack, they're easy to move, and they're easy to carry. So it meant a lot of really useful boxes, a lot of packing materials, and many, many, many handwritten movement sheets documenting what we put in each box to make sure as we moved across, we didn't lose anything. That being said, moving the entire museum in 6 months does mean that things go a little awry. I've called this slide the aftermath of not enough time. Not everything worked perfectly. The main thing that sticks in my mind is we have lost about 3 items total. One is a set of pig nose rings. One is a set of baby socks that we think probably went awry during some conservation work. They were being washed, and we think they probably ended up, we hope, in a wrong box, but at the moment they might have gone elsewhere. And a belt that goes with some military trousers that we think never actually made it out of the museum. It might have gone awry long before we actually started moving anything. All of which you can see on our little unaccounted board there. So that's the nose rings, the belt, and then the socks off to themselves. The other thing is that losing things in plain sight. We had a box of glass that we knew we had, and we literally found it last week. Because we'd moved all these boxes across, and we'd gone through, our conservation team have been going through piece by piece doing condition reports, and we knew we had about 1 box equivalent worth of stuff that we just had not gone through, we hadn't got condition reports for, and we actually found the box sitting exactly where it obviously should be, in the glass room, just somewhere that we hadn't checked. We'd obviously all thought we'd checked that box, and we just hadn't. So we have been going through. It means a lot of unpacking and repacking, and it does mean a lot of figuring out things on the fly. But we're getting there, and we are actually getting a handle, I think, on pretty much everything that we've moved. As I said, we had an awful lot of volunteers as part of this. They can do a lot of stuff. We have one dedicated volunteer who comes 2 mornings a week who makes our boxes. He's an ex-engineer, and he has that kind of 3D brain, and he makes every single box that we use to house our collections. We also have at least 20 volunteers on a Tuesday who come and do conservation work dedicated. That being said, I think there can be up to about 35 of them if they all came, but regularly it's about 20, and Mary, who's our conservator, who is also here today, runs that program for us, and figuring out how to teach people who have never done these skills how to clean, condition report, and do those basic repairs safely, which means that she doesn't have to do absolutely every repair in our museum, because I think she'd go insane if she did. The other thing, you've probably noticed that there is a textile snake on one of my slides. He is to replace a specimen that we lost. We used to have an almost 11-foot long snake. It's documented in our accession book, and there's actually picture evidence of it in some sketches of one of the rooms that we used to occupy, but we don't have that specimen anymore. So one of our volunteers took on the task to make one for us. So she figured out the exact dimensions, she's figured out what type of snake it should be, and the colours are accurate to that kind of snake. Obviously, we don't know quite exactly what the one we had looked like, but this one is I think, pretty good representation, and she's now actually knitting us various organ specimens that we know we all had at one point in time. So we're hoping to gently replace some of those things that we know we've lost over the time. The main thing I'd say if you are working with volunteers is make sure that they can say no. There are some people that like to do certain tasks, and there's some people that hate to do certain tasks, and there's no point getting someone who might be really good at one thing to be doing a completely separate thing when they could be doing something that they are both interested in and useful at doing. The other thing that I want to say is about our Heritage Associates. As I said, one of them isn't in the room today, and this is a programme we've been trialling for the last year and a bit for early career development. We have 2 at a time coming and doing 4 to 6 week placements, essentially as a crash course in museum training, handling, packing, everything that you might possibly need to go on to do a heritage job in a museum setting. And as somebody who, I always say, fell into this job, I was very lucky to be volunteering with the society before I went off to do my master's. And when I finished my master's, they were just looking for that full-time member of staff. So I slid in my CV and got it. But every other heritage person here that's been trying to get a job will know that that is incredibly rare. It's really hard to find jobs in the heritage sector, especially at the moment. They're really hard to come by, especially when they're this amazing. But it's been such a rewarding thing to be able to teach other people the skills that I've learned alongside working with the society. So long may that continue. This is a bit about what we are doing currently. So we are, as I mentioned, Modes is our current collection system, and it's not the friendliest. So we're actually currently working to move to Collections Index Plus as of beginning of next year, which will hopefully make our collection a lot more accessible and a lot easier to access remotely, especially as we're closed. But that means that we are looking into a lot of digitization. We're looking into actually cataloguing a lot of our archive for the first time. A lot of it hasn't even got hand lists. So it's working through that so that we actually know what we've got in our archive holdings. Working on our handling collection, we've got a couple of items that we've earmarked for that, but we haven't actually made a lot of progress with that recently with the move. And our deaccessioning, again, there's an awful lot of items that we think would be better off housed elsewhere. There was a period of time where the society really did take everything, and a lot of things aren't appropriate for us now. So those are all the things that are on the list to do over the next year or so as we're closed. Having said that, we're also planning the redisplay of an entire museum again for early 27. So having just packed the entire building, we are then going to be redisplaying that entire building again in early 2027. So we have a couple of ways that we're hoping that will make that process simpler for us. We have just been given a grant for setting up a Collections Champions program, which is for our existing volunteers and members to try and get them involved in that curation side of things that they haven't necessarily had a chance to do before, as well as a young curators scheme for 16 to 25-year-olds who, again, might be looking into those early heritage careers and trying to get them involved in curation. We have plans for a long-term HA alongside that, again, to try and help us with that planning. And hopefully it means that we can just walk in there and do it in as little time as I'm sure this building product is going to give us, because as we all know, building products always overrun. So we'll see what we do. I think I'm now handing back over to Dustin. So thank you very much.
And as if that isn't enough, within 6 months of receiving that MEND grant, we were notified that we had been given a National Lottery Heritage Fund grant for the project that you can see on the screen here. And this is technically the New Beginnings project. The site next door to the museum, which you could see briefly in the very first slide, has long been abandoned. It was purchased for us by a local trust. And everything in that sort of periwinkle color is the design for an expansion to bring onto one site the facilities that are currently scattered over 2 leased units and 4 rooms in Ascovy Hall Museum. So bringing all of this back together under one roof as it was intended in the founding vision. So a major sort of 13 to 14 million pound capital project, all told, once this is done. And to give you a sense of scale, again, the bit in yellow is the existing museum. And I just want to end with our founder, Morris Johnson, writing to his boyhood friend, William Stukely, in 1728 about his vision for SGS. He says that, "I hope that I may hereafter be thought to have been a friend to the whole neighborhood and a sort of father to this place, if by this means, that is the founding of the society and the establishing of its collections, if by this means the arts and sciences are advanced in it and the people bettered by it. All of the work we're doing in New Beginnings ultimately begins here in 1728. And Johnson's favorite phrase, pro bono publico, for the public benefit. New Beginnings. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for such fantastic presentations. I wonder if we've got any questions. Just down here, do you want to wait for the microphone?
Thank you. Well, I think you deserve an amazing congratulations for all of that, really. You know, it proves it can be done. A daft question, de-accessing, I understand the word, but what and how, please?
As an accredited museum, we have to go through a de-accessioning process. That means that every object that we want to remove from our accession collection has to have a rationale for disposal, essentially. And that might be disposal to another museum, that might be disposal to sell, it might be disposal to put it in a bin if it's that bad. But every single item has to have a written down rationale individually for it, and a score as to whether as to justify our getting rid of it, basically. So it's quite an involved process, especially as we think we're probably nearing on 100 items odd that we think might want to go through that process of figuring out whether we can actually get rid of it. But yeah, so that it's a long process, and that's what it entails. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions before we finish up? Just one last one at the back. Perfect.
Thank you. One of the pleasures of older museums is the eclectic nature of the collection. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what sort of items might be de-accessioned.
In terms of what items we're de-accessioning, as I said, there was a phase where they really did take every single item that was brought into the building. So for example, the thing that comes to mind is that there is a print plaque of the Titanic. I'm not quite sure why we have it. I'm not quite sure what function it serves to us as a museum. So it's on the list for going. There's also things like we had an entire tub of sand from Dunkirk Beach, which sounds like it could be an interesting thing, but then you realize it was collected in the 70s, long after the war was done. And then it becomes less interesting. We have actually figured that one out quite quickly because it is part of a larger military collection by an individual. So we've kept a much smaller jam jar of that sample rather than the entire Tupperware of it that we did have. So it's those kind of individual processes of looking at items that don't fit with our larger collecting policy, basically.
Great. Thank you all very much. We're now meeting for the displays and demonstrations, which Anushka will talk us through. Thank you all so much. And thank you so much to all of our speakers this morning. You've all been marvellous.
Thank you. And thank you to Alex for chairing. So you'll note we're already running a little bit behind schedule, but we're very flexible and you're being very patient. So thank you. The next portion of the day is, as Alex says, we're going to have some displays and demonstrations. So I encourage you to go up to the library. There are more staff and volunteers from each of the organisations here whom you haven't yet had a chance to meet. So this is a chance for you to go and have a conversation with them, see some objects, and have a bit more of a hands-on idea of what we're all doing and more of the really impressive and ambitious work that is happening at each of these organisations. So downstairs, you'll also have some demonstrations from some our colleagues at Spalding. We also have, if we can set them up, 2 shops, because I know what you really need in your lives is some antiquarian Christmas cards for people who are here in person. So if you're online, if you can join us back with the second link at 2 p.m. When we'll kick off with some more panels. And then final note from me is that if you are, particularly if you're early in your career and you would like to have a free portrait photograph, please come and find me. We have a wonderful photographer, Aniela Weinberger, whom you might have seen wandering around already. So come and find me and we'll make sure that you have a portrait session. So lunch will be at approximately 1 p.m. and until then you are free to wander and enjoy conversations with each other. Thank you all.